training chamber ran along the flanks of the tribune for half a kilometer. Blast doors closed tank-wide holes in one wall, shutting out the void beyond. The floor was a tangle of barricades and fire-scorched debris. Weapon servitors hung from the ceiling, sliding along gantries to rain fire from different angles required by the training scenario. As I glanced up, I saw that the barrels of the servitors' cannons were glowing red. The guns increased their rate of fire. Sparks danced across the rim of my boarding shield. Lines of tracer fire scored the air above my head. My shield arm was vibrating with the impact of hard rounds. A line of tracer hit the crown of my helm, and I felt muscles tear in my neck. To either side of me, two of my first squad stood with their shields braced across the left of their body, their legs set. Each shield was a thick plate of palesteel, 2/3 our height. The snouts of bolters jutted from the vertical slot cut into the right-hand side of each shield. Stood shoulder to shoulder, we created a wall of metal. In battles fought in the guts of starships, this is what keeps you alive and allows you to win. Fighting this way is blunt and ugly. It is killing with discipline and workmanlike routine. It is perhaps the method of war I am closest to enjoying. "Advance with fire!" I roared. Our targets were server-rigged automata that moved present patterns to mimic the response of a determined enemy. Only when we had closed the distance would real opponents replace machines and servitors. We began to sweep forwards, and every step was a volley of bolter fire, repeated with lethal rhythm. Questions rang in my head in time with our tread. Was Tyr right? Should we try and break through the storms? After the sensory and psychic onslaught we had come to full alert and waited for an enemy to show their face. They had not come. And the weeks had passed, and the drumbeat of questions grew in my mind.
"Enemy 10 meters front, close,"
shouted Raun from my right. I could not see the enemy without looking over my shield, but I did not need to. Raun had seen, and I trusted his judgment. Was the foul system really a trap? The population of its planets were missing, and we had seemed to come under a form of psychic attack. But we had not found the cause of the onslaught. There could be other factors at work. Our being here could simply be coincidence.
"Open ranks!"
called Raun. Our shield wall opened, peeling back just before the enemy hit. 5 Imperial fists in a tight wedge, hammers and chainsaws ready. Skill at war is a blade edge made sharp only by harsh practice, and so I had picked the best of the company as our close-quarter opponents. They came at us as I intended, like they wanted to kill us. The 5 came through the gap in our shield wall and spilled into the space behind.
"Close!"
shouted Raun. Our ranks closed, enveloping the mock enemies within a tight ring of our shields. Can I do this? A fifth of a legion on full alert, drilling for an attack that I believed was coming. What if I'm wrong? A hammer blow hit my shield with a sound like a gong. An instant later, one of the 5 enemy warriors had rammed his shoulder into the point where mine and Raun's shields touched. It was Setter, sergeant of the 6th Squad, an old warrior seasoned by the conquest of worlds. He was also lethally fast. In the instant that the gap opened within our shields, he had stepped forwards, forcing it wider and bringing his hammer down on my head. My vision swam. I blinked, and in that second Setter was through our shield wall. He kicked Raun's leg out from under him, and suddenly there was a wide hole in the circle of our shields. Above us, the gun servitors rose, and their hoists and bullets began to fall on our heads like rain. I raised my shield high, covering my head. Setter's hammer had hit me in the gut. I staggered, and a second blow crashed into my faceplate. The eye lenses of my helm shattered, reg fragments spilling down my front like drops of blood. I was dead, or would have been in a true fight. "End!" I called over the vox. A second later, the gunfire slackened, as the servitors hanging from the weapon gantries cycled their slug cannons to silence. I pulled my helmet off. Pieces of red glass ringed the eye sockets like shattered teeth. Around me, my company lowered their weapons. Sulphurous weapon smoke fogged the air. Countless chips and gouges had stripped everyone's armor back to the dull metal beneath. Flattened slugs smeared the fronts of our boarding shields.
There was an opening, Fleet Master,
Said Setter, bowing his head as he spoke.
a momentary gap in your guard. I used it to break the shield wall.
I nodded. It is the duty of all Imperial fists to recognize weakness. Setter was right. My thoughts and focus had drifted. In a real fight, it could have led to slaughter and failure.
Thank you, brother,
I said with a nod. Setter moved away, his hammer hanging loose from his fists. I looked at the battered helm in my hand. Anger buzzed behind my eyes. I had allowed my doubts to make me weak. If I could not find the strength to bear my duty, then I would kill us all. There may be no enemy coming for you, whispered a craven voice in the back of my thoughts. Tyr may be right, and your duty may lie down another path. I thought of Sigismund, our first captain. This was to have been his duty to bear, but he had returned to Terra with the Primarch. I thought of the steps of mischance that meant that his duty now rested in my hands. Would it have been as heavy in his?
Not bad.
Ral's voice cut through my thoughts. He had come to stand at my shoulder. Blade cuts and gunfire had pitted and gouged his armor. He pulled his own helmet off, and took a deep breath as if savoring the thick smells of battle training.
The wall broke.
I growled.
For the first time in 4 hours.
It still broke.
Response and cohesion have increased.
Another 4 hours, I said. Ral held up his helmet as if in surrender, and I saw the hint of a smile on his scarred lump of a face. I have no idea why he smiles.
The artificers will not thank you.
Another 4 hours. I hefted my shield, feeling its reassuring weight. Ral raised an eyebrow, but nodded and began to shout orders. The company began to reform. Overhead, the gun gantries repositioned into different configurations. I did not care if the artificers had to rebuild every suit or armor in the fleet. When the enemy came, we needed to be ready. The opinions of others, whether they agreed or not, were no matter. Strength requires obedience, not thought. I clamped my eyeless helm on my head. I would be without the information fed to me through the helmet's eyes lenses, but I would continue anyway. In war, you cannot rely on anything except your brothers. To do otherwise is weakness.
Begin!
I called. The hammer chime of gunfire filled my ears.
Fleet Master!
The helm's officer's voice cut through the noise as I was about to give the first order. It was Kartis, a human veteran of 50 years in service to the Imperial Fists, and the man I had trusted with coordinating the sweep of the system planets, moons, and asteroid belts. He was not the type to be easily shaken, but I could hear the tension in his voice. Was it an attack? Alarms would have rang through the ship. No, it was something else, something important enough to alert me immediately, but not enough to raise general alarm. I hear you, Kartis.
We have received a signal from our search units.
Kartis paused. I could hear the chatter of signal readouts and box distortion in the background.
They have found something.
Tyr came with me. Perhaps I wanted him to see it and to answer his own questions, but perhaps there was another, less worthy motivation. Our steps clanged dully as we approached the dead machine at the center of the gloom-filled chamber. I glanced at Tyr, but his eyes stayed fixed on the isolated circle of bright light. The chamber had been an ordnance magazine. Its walls were 3 meters thick, and its triple-layered blast doors sealed by stratified layers of ciphered codes. The machine sat alone, under a buzzing stasis field, a specimen pinned out for display and then locked away from sight. Automated gun turrets twitched at our approach and then cycled to stillness. It was as if we had passed into a shadow world that had formed like a cyst around a secret. We stopped and looked at what the search teams had pulled from the ocean of Foul 2. The machine glistered under the stab lights, water beading its bare metal body, the stasis field tinting the drops to sapphire. It had suffered severe damage, but its form was still clear. A blunt-edged cube of metal, studded with thruster vents and ugly protrusions. Its shell had been cracked open, first by jagged wounds that to my eye looked like impact hits, and then by the smooth cuts of melt-a-torch. The tech priests had dissected it and left it with its innards exposed. I could see a jumble of cables and clusters of glass blisters like lidless eyes. Dribbles of yellow fluid hung unmoving from severed tubes. Shattered crystals had spilled over the stained floor. At its heart was something grey and soft, like a corpse bloated in lightless water. I could see a spine under pale skin, and above that a nest of cables haloing ahead, its eyes and mouth stapled shut. There were no arms or legs, just stumps. A thick smell of ionized air filled my nose, and my teeth ached in time with the field's hum. I had seen countless servitors created by Mechanicum, and had waded knee-deep through mutilated bodies, but there was something about the machine and the amputated torso that was utterly repellent. I had examined it before, when the search teams first brought it abroad, but without the crowding tech priests and labor servitors it felt different. It felt like going to a grave's edge to look down at the remains of a secret atrocity. Tyr let out a careful, controlled breath beside me.
What is it?
He said, his voice echoing in the empty chamber. We don't know, at least not with certainty, I said. Tyr was moving around the edge of his stasis dome. The search units I sent to Fall 2 found it floating in the oceans, but it has clearly been exposed to the void. The adepts tell me that the machine components have several purposes. Tyr gave a small nod, but was silent as I pointed to the different portions of the wreckage. Most of it is made up of high-gain auger arrays and broad-spectrum sensors effective over a relatively short range. Then there is the human component. Apparently it would have been in a state of hibernation, kept alive with minimal power usage. Their assessment is that it was in orbit around Fall 2, suffered damage and fell to the planet's surface. Tyr was still staring at the grey remains of the human in the machine. I glanced at it, then away. It made me want to shiver.
Some form of servitor control sensor vehicle? An asteroid survey unit, perhaps?
The adepts think it's unlikely. In addition to the sensor equipment, some of the systems seem to be a form of psi amplifier. Tyr looked up.
This created the psi attack?
This and others like them. There were hundreds of energy signatures detected. There are most likely many more.
We need to find and destroy them. They could trigger again at any moment.
This one fell through the ocean's planet atmosphere as its orbit decayed. Our search teams would never have found it without the flare-light of its re-entry. I looked back at the broken machine and its pitiful occupant. It sustained damage, but the adepts say that the most of its system had already burnt out. Its occupant was already dead. Tyr shook his head, his face taut with an emotion I could not read.
They were killed once they had been activated?
He breathed. There was a note of disbelief and rage in his voice. Objects this size, now dead and without power, we could sift the system for a decade and find nothing. With no population on the planet, there is no way of knowing who put them here or why they attacked us.
You're correct, but it was no attack.
You say that now? I could see the months of dispute and controlled animosity straining at his will. After the psychic attack, Tyr had not dropped his calls for the fleet to try and break the storms. If anything, his attitude had become more unyielding, as had mine. I had hoped that he would have seen the full implication of the recovered machine and that my decisions had been correct. It was a weakness, and like everything built on weakness, it was doomed. Look at it, brother. Tyr's eyes flicked back at the machine skimming over its broken form.
The sensors, the auger, the communication shifters, The psychic screams we all felt were not attacks. They were a message.
He looked up at me, and I saw that he understood at last.
It was no attack, brother. It was a prelude to one.
The Imperial Palace, Terra. Silence followed the messenger. The click of her staff echoed through the corridors as she approached the planning chamber. Figures pulled back before her, their eyes following her steps, their whispered conversations stilling as if they could sense the weight of the news she carried. 4 gold-plated custodians flanked her, and black sentinels followed in her wake like armored mourners. Within the planning chamber, Sigismund caught the movement from beyond the chamber's open door and looked up. He saw the approaching messenger, and the look on the astropath's withered and blind face. Something cold ran over his flesh at the sight. He knew the astropath. Her name was Armina Fell. She had served the Imperium for 3 decades. That service had bent her spine and turned her hair to the white of raw cotton. She had brought countless messengers to Dorne, most of bad news, some frustrating, but none of it had required an escort. It was almost as if what she brought needed to be guarded like a prisoner in case it slipped its bindings and ran free. Sigismund turned to look at his father, but if Rogel Dorn had seen the approaching procession, he gave no sign. Badok Singh was outlining his proposed fortification of the Imperial Palace. The war mason paced amongst the broad pillars, perfumed smoke puffing from his mouth as he sucked on his long-stemmed pipe. Dorn stayed in the center of the room, frowning down at the plans spread across the table of the room's center. Brass projection apparatus hung from the ceiling, scattering images of Singh's plans across the chamber's sandstone walls. The room seemed almost peaceful, but Sigismund knew that this short moment of calm was a lie. He had returned from Mars to find the atmosphere of uncertainty and fear growing stronger with every day. It was as if the whole of Terra was holding its breath and waiting to see where the next blow would fall.
The Dawalagiri elevation,
Said Dorn, scowling at the sprawling schematics.
You think that necessary?
Not necessary.
Purred Singh.
Necessity, Rogel.
The war mason flickered a skeletal finger at one of his silk-robed slaves, and the man changed the focus on one of the projection lenses.
Look at the inherent weakness in the alignment of the outer elements. You of all people must see that if this section of the palace is to hold, we must remake it, and remake it now.
Normally the war mason's familiarity would have angered Sigismund, but he barely heard the words. The procession was at the chamber's open doorway. Behind Sigismund, Dorn gave a low snort.
Necessity is a word that makes me suspicious, old friend.
Sigismund watched Armina Fell and her escort pause on the threshold. The astropath brought her hand up to the empty pits that were her eyes. Pearls of moisture glittered on her cheeks. She is crying, he realized. Beside her, one of the custodians brought the butt of his spear down 3 times on the stone floor. The sound of the blows rippled through the pillared chamber. Dorn raised his head slowly.
There is news,
He said in a flat voice and looked at Armina Fell. For a moment, Sigismund thought he saw an unreadable expression flicker across his father's face.
It's all right, mistress. Please tell us what you must.
The woman's lips were trembling.
Word from Istvan, my lord.
She took a ragged breath. Dorn stepped forwards, his black robes falling back from his arms as he reached out. He gently raised her face until her empty eyes looked up at him.
Mistress,
He said softly.
what has happened?
Armina shook herself, poise and strength returning to her features as if some of Dorn's stillness and strength had flowed into her. She began to speak, her voice the monotone drone of precise recall.
Imperial counterstrike massacred on Istvan 5. Vulcan and Korax missing. Ferrus Manus dead. Night Lords, Iron Warriors, Alpha Legion, and Wordbearers are with Horus Lupercal.
Nothing moved in the chamber. The black sentinels and custodians stood like statues of jet and gold. Badok Singh simply stared at Armina, the ember in the bowl of his pipe cooling to grey ash. For a moment Sigismund felt nothing, as if what he had heard had stripped all sensation away. A Primarch dead, 2 lost, 3 legions gone, and 4 gone from a friend to enemy in the space of a handful of words? This is it, thought Sigismund, as she showed me. This is the true beginning of the end. If 4 more legions can turn against us, then why not more still? They shall come here, and here we must stand, and stand alone. He realized that he was shaking, taut muscles vibrating under scarred skin. For a second he wondered if it was fear, if that long-dead emotion had returned to him after so long. Then he recognized the sensation. It was hate. Hate so bright and focused that he could almost see it. Let them come. Here my father stands, and I will stand with him. Torn hands fell from Armina's face. His eyes were black holes in a facade of stone. Hard control radiated from him like cold, glacial ice. He looked at Sigismund. For an instant Sigismund thought he saw a reflection of his own anger in his father's eyes, a flash of rage quickly hidden.
Find any remnants of the new betrayers that remain in the system.
Dorn's voice was hoarse growl.
Use whatever and whoever you need. Take them or destroy them as you must. Do it now, my son.
Sigismund began to kneel, but Dorn was already turning back to Armina. The astropath flinched and his eyes fixed on her.
Get a message to the Retribution fleet. They must return here immediately.
Armina swayed as his words were a storm wind.
Lord Dorn, we had no word from them.
She swallowed.
They may have reached System 5 before the massacre. They may...
Her voice trailed away as Dorn took a step closer.
If you have to burn through 1,000 astropaths, you will reach them.
Dorn's voice was low, but it seemed to fill the room.
Bring my sons back to Terra.
The Estevan system.
This information is accurate?
Gold's question broke the silence, but the tension remained. The only sound was the hum of armor and the dull rumble of the Ironblood's reactors. Gold shifted his hunched augmentics, hissing nervously. The other Iron Warriors captains kept their eyes on the luminous surface of the hollow table, their shapes casting bloated shadows onto the walls. They were the senior commanders of the legions, those that had the Primarch's countenance. Forex, his gaunt face framed by a hood of vulcanized rubber. Berossus, his pale eyes glittering above his sneering half-smile. Harkor, in Terminator armor still black with soot from the slaughter on Estevan 5. Darkron, his face hidden behind a slot-eyed faceplate. Varek, his face so twisted by scar tissue that it looked like chewed meat. None of them looked at Golg. They were waiting to see how Perturabo would respond. They had all known others who had presumed Lords of Iron favor and paid for the mistake. Gold raised his eyes from the luminous columns of data. Perturabo was watching him, his gaze unmoving. Golg felt the danger in that glittering gaze, the force of destruction behind the oil-black eyes. A hammer, as tall as Golg himself, rested head down under Perturabo's hand. The black iron head gleamed in the ember of the light that lit the chamber. Perturabo made the smallest of movements toward the illuminated table.
It comes from the War Master,
said Perturabo, his eyes moving from Golg to the other captains. None met his gaze. Golg ran his eyes down the glowing data runes. What it represented left his mouth dry. Over 300 warships, caught in a backwater system, like fish in a whirlpool. A fleet of ships pinned in place and waiting for extermination. And here were all of those ships' dispositions and characteristics, listed and laid out in cold light. It was too perfect, too neat. How could even the War Master achieve such a thing? It was daunting in its implications. There was possibility here, though the possibility to rise high in the sight of the Primarch. Golg knew that the other captains would be thinking the same. They would be judging how much power they could gain, and how high were the risks. Golg opened his mouth to ask another question, but Forik spoke before him.
This information was gathered firsthand?
Perturabo nodded once.
By scout elements in the system.
Golg managed to hide his surprise at Perturabo's words. So this was no random event, he thought. This was planned before we came to kill the weakling legions on Istavan. But then what else would he expect from the War Master and the Lord of Iron? He thought of the massacre they had just committed, of the legions they had butchered. They were weak, and destroying them had been nothing more than another task to be completed. But the Imperial Fists were rivals of old, arrogant pretenders to honors and reputations they had bought with lies. Golg felt himself smile. The possibility of breaking Dordan's sun was a prospect so rich he could almost taste it. Was this part of the price of our allegiance to Horus, he wondered? The chance to break one enemy bought by the death of others?
What of the storms?
Asked Harkor, eyes hooded by a frown.
If they cannot penetrate them, how will we? Our passage would be possible. The War Master guarantees it.